Hello there and welcome back to Bloodborne. I'm afraid today's update isn't going to be an especially substantial one, it's just a few more Chalice dungeons. The Lower Loran and Great Is Chalice specifically. There are trace remains of medical procedures in parts of ailing Loran. Whether these were attempts to control the scourge of the beast or the cause of the outbreak is unknown. So yeah, this lost land of Loran has clear connections to the beast plague, but they're kept pretty vague in the details. It's probably safe to assume that Loran was once a land like Yharnam, but we really can't say much more than that. Oh, and as to what was going on there, I had previously used up materials to make a Lower Loran chalice that I went in for a bit. I had intended to do it with Rangpur, but we weren't able to connect, and I ended up doing the first layer. I wanted to do this from fresh, so I deleted that one and used the glyph system to make another. Once you've made a chalice dungeon of a certain type, you can search for ones made by others and make them for free. Useful if you need some extra chalice dungeon materials and don't want to spend more to get them. As for Lower Loran itself, it's not really much different than the previous Ailing Loran chalice dungeon, it's just slightly harder, being a depth 5 dungeon as opposed to a depth 4 dungeon. As such, like the previous chalice dungeon video, I'll just be showing off the various highlights of us getting backdoor new encounters. I did leave in the entirety of the first layer here though, just to show how much easier this dungeon is than the previous Cursed Thumera one, despite being a depth below it. The fact that you actually have your full HP makes things a lot easier even if the enemies do more damage and have more health. After all, the issue in that dungeon was being one-shot or just taken out so much more quickly due to the reduced health. Without that, this tends to go so much more smoothly. There were far fewer deaths in this run. I think there were 2 deaths, one from me and one from Rangpur in this dungeon, and then a few more from me against one of the bosses in the next dungeon we'll be covering, the Is dungeon. But that's it. I think I mentioned this when covering Ailing Loran before, but if you're entering into this dungeon, you definitely want to bring a weapon that is especially effective against beasts. Basically any weapon with the serrated property, because pretty much all of the enemies you find here are beasts, and having that little bit of extra damage can help a lot. So, let's get to our first boss then, who I probably should have cut to directly rather than show running back to. My bad on that, I got rather lazy editing this episode. Chalice dungeons just make me feel like not giving much in the way of effort, I think because they themselves don't have all that much effort put into them. Like, I've complained about this before, but there really should be more room varieties, more room layouts, more enemy layouts within those rooms. It just needs to be more stuff, and that would make the Chalice dungeons a lot more fun to go through. But I've bitched about that a bunch before, so I'll just leave it there. Alright, so now that we're actually coming up to the first boss, you want to guess what it is? If you've been paying attention, you can probably follow the general pattern of what the first 2 or 3 bosses in Chalice dungeons tend to be, which is to say not actual bosses and just mini-bosses that they've slapped health bars onto. And this, of course, is no different, being a Loran Silver Beast. So the thing guarding the lever to open up the boss room is in fact the same boss that we're fighting. And he goes down kinda pathetically. If you're good with the stagger timings, it's nothing. Like, you do a third of its health, if not more. And thrusting attacks do pretty good as well. Or you can just stun lock it with the Beast Cutter. Or, not the Beast Cutter, the Whirligig Saw. Forgot about the name for a second. But yeah, it's a complete choke. Even more so than the mini-boss reuses tend to be. So this here is the beginning of the second layer, and they immediately throw a ton of the female beast patients at you. And yeah, I just wanted to include this here to show that even if it is easier than the Defiled Thumera Chalice, it's still a depth 5 Chalice dungeon. It's still tough content, the toughest in the game, honestly, since it's leveled for New Game Plus, if not New Game Plus 2 or beyond. They do a lot of damage in addition to that poison constantly leeching, which you can't really cure on a dime if you forgot to equip antidotes like I did. In fact, they do enough damage that Vangpur loses his life. How sad. But yeah, look at that. Even with the full combo with the Rakuyo, which shits out damage, I only took out around half of its health. The scaling that the Depth 5 Chalice dungeons have is a bit ridiculous sometimes. So I mentioned that I would die in this video as well, and this here is why in a few seconds. But this is not just a spider hell, this is another double spider hell. Two bell-ringing women summoning hordes of spiders, and yeah, it goes about as well as it could be. And unfortunately, this is not the only time I die to them. I come back to try and recover my blood echoes, but things don't go so smoothly. The real difficulty is not the spiders themselves, it's the fact that it's really tough to kill the woman infinitely summoning them. Oh, Vangpur just lost his life again. The room is so large and so smoke-filled that it can be difficult to locate them from afar, and all the while you're being harried by spiders and whatever other enemies are in the immediate vicinity. So it's really tough to do a lot of damage to them. I managed to kill the first one pretty quickly, but I literally ran around for a good 2 or 3 minutes searching for the second, and by the time I found her, yeah, kinda mobbed to death. And I don't show this, but I ended up dying one more time when retrieving the blood echoes, so those were lost forever, so I just went on to the boss. At least this time it's an actual boss for a boss, rather than just a mini-boss gussied up as a boss. Say that 5 times fast. But yeah, otherwise this fight goes pretty much the same as the previous Abhorrent Beast fight. I only left it in just in case you really wanted to watch a boss fight. I'm not actually going to commentate over this, so if you're not interested, just skip ahead a few minutes. So one cool thing about this dungeon is that this is the first time you can come across a Bath Messenger shop inside a Chalice dungeon. They offer the same stuff, same basic consumables as the Hunter's Dream, albeit at an increased price, but also some unique stuff in the form of every alternate weapon that you can pick up in the Chalice dungeons, the ones with different gem slots, so you don't gotta farm for them quite as hard. They also tend to have a root Chalice dungeon if you're really into doing randomized Chalice dungeons. So definitely a spot worth stopping by, even if only to restock up on blood vials as you make your way through the dungeon. Here we have another encounter with a keeper and its hunting dogs. This becomes a pretty common encounter you find in the lower depth Chalice dungeons, probably because it's a pretty damn difficult one if you aggro everything at once. In fact, in this case it ended up being tough enough that, well, someone lost their life here. There we go. At least this time it's Vangpur losing lives all the time rather than me. But yeah, I just wanted to show that off. I'm not gloating or anything. So here we come to the final boss of this Chalice dungeon, which is kind of unique. At the very least it's someone we haven't seen in quite a while. It's Dark Beast Paul, or as it's renamed here, the Loran Dark Beast. The fight itself isn't any different from the previous fight with Paul, nor is its look changed, the only difference is the name. The fact that it's called the Loran Dark Beast specifically though means this is a Dark Beast specifically from Loran. Further connecting the lost land of Loran to the Dark Beasts, we already see somewhat of a connection with the Silver Beasts, who create the same blue sparks that Dark Beasts are known for. I can't really say too much more about it than that, since again, we're really not given any more information, and I'm not one to just kinda make shit up, at least not too much. Since the fight itself is pretty much the same, I'm just gonna leave the fight here for you to watch, uncommentated. So that's Paul down. So let's go on to the next chalice, the Great Is Chalice. Great Chalices unlock deeper reaches of the labyrinth. The Great Is Chalice became the cornerstone of the choir, the elite delegation of the Healing Church. It was also the first Great Chalice brought back to the surface since the time of Bergenworth, and allowed the choir to have audience with the Beatus. Some interesting lore tidbits. So let's get right on into the dungeon then. I really like the Great Is dungeon and wish that more of the fixed chalice dungeons were of this type due to how it looks. So, room layout wise, it's all the rooms we've seen before with maybe a few new ones, I'm not entirely sure. But they've all been reskinned to have this sort of underwater aquatic theme. And I really like that. As you saw with the Loran Chalice dungeons, they tried changing up the visual style there a little bit, but as far as I'm considered it was far too little. This on the other hand is on a whole nother level, like it literally looks like you're underwater. If the other two non-Thumelo Chalice dungeon types had distinct aesthetics like this, I think they'd be a lot more fun to go through. Not mechanically of course, but at least you'd have a nice feast for the eyes as opposed to just same old drab shit over and over. Unfortunately, this Chalice dungeon continues the trends of the bosses being just dull mini-bosses that take like a few minutes to kill at most, and aren't really at all a threat. Like seriously, there were so many bosses from the main game that they could have just plopped in here, would have made more interesting fights. And you don't even really need to justify it lore-wise, like, you can just assume that the labyrinths, the versions that you fight there are some sort of dream or something and it would fit. Well, if nothing else, Rang Purse shows off the stun-locking power of that one move of the Whirligig. The L2, if you hold it for a while, it's really good against humanoid opponents that are easily stunned like this, even if the boss is like Lady Maria. The second boss is somewhat more interesting, being the larger variant of the Celestial Emissary, or at least it would be if it weren't lacking the main gimmick of that fight, the constantly spawning, swarming, smaller Celestial Emissaries. and the fact that in the first phase of the fight the bigger one is hiding as one of those small ones. I really don't get why they didn't just copy and paste that boss exactly. It would have made for a more interesting fight if it had kept its gimmick. My only guess is that they would have had to have done coding specifically for a room that allows for that type of spawning behavior or something, and they didn't feel like doing it. Anyway, aside from the lack of a bunch of helpers, this fight goes the exact same. Try to use bolt and piercing damage when possible, as those are the most effective against him. So before we get to the last boss of this Chalice dungeon here, let's check in on another one of those Bath Messenger shops in the Chalice dungeons. Here we're gonna buy a bit more than blood vials. I decided on purchasing both variants of the Kha's Parasite because that is a weapon we'll be using in the future, and having more options for gem slots is pretty good because that weapon requires pretty specific blood gem types in order to be an effective weapon. But that's it, so let's check out the final boss who you may have been able to guess given the general theming of this dungeon. It's Ebrietas again. Now, much more difficult considering she has a significant stat buff. Even with my 40 vigor, she does quite a lot of damage with her charge attack. Granted, it did extra damage there because she attacked me while I was using a weapon, or an arcane tool at least, and thus I took increased damage. So, as far as the fight goes, again, it's nothing changed, she's just tougher. However, she in particular especially benefits from the stat boost, specifically that of her damage boost. And that's because she has a number of attacks that are really difficult to avoid. I'd say she's right after Amygdala in terms of difficulty of avoiding all the attacks. For most of her attacks, pretty much her entire body becomes a hurt box, and given all the tentacles flowing around, that can make it really difficult to dodge some of the attacks. Add to that my incompetence, and you have a fight where I ended up dying far more times than I should have. It wasn't as bad as defiled Amygdala, but I still ended up dying a good 3 or 4 times I think. I cut most of them out though. Thankfully, we both had pretty good builds for this fight. Vangpur with his Whirligig, which is just ridiculously good against any enemy, and me with my mostly arcane focused build, and thus has a lot of ranged options to strike at her head from a relatively safe distance. Of course, it's not always safe to be far away from her, essential to her ridiculous charge attack. But yeah, that's about all I have to say about Ebrietas V2, so I'll just leave the rest of the clip for you. Next time you can look forward to a proper update again as we go through the Nightmare of Mensis Part 2. We're getting pretty close to the finale of the game. Look forward to it.